Typologies of the point of view. The most significant authors. We will have a look now at several typologies of the point of view, ranging from the simplest to the more complicated. But before this, let's have a look at the main schools. So there are several schools of narratology worldwide, and we have French and Belgian school represented by Pouillon, Jeannette, Vitou, and this is using two criteria. It's flexible, it's synthetic, but as a minus, it has generally too few resulting types. Then the German school, represented by Franz Stenzel, Philharm Figure, and Bertil Romberg, who's actually Norwegian, but he wrote in German, uses three criteria, is analytical, considers the future evolutions of the novel. The Russian school used to be very, very strong, very important during the Russian formalist school, and it's represented by Mikhail Bakhtin and Boris Uspensky. This school uses a larger number of criteria, 4 to 5, and interestingly includes an ideological criterion. There is then the Dutch school, represented by Mieke Bal and Jaap Lindveld, which is ingenious but generally is of limited applicability. The Czech school used to be at the beginnings of narratology, was very important, represented by Lubomir Doležel, and these are pioneers who created quite complicated typologies based on several models. And then the American school, Norman Friedman, Percy Lubbock, which is intuitively built around usually just one or maybe two criteria, but it is not very systematic. If you ask me, probably the most interesting and applicable models out of these schools would be the German school, because it tends to produce a sufficient number of types to be used over a wide range of texts. There are interesting elements in the Russian school, especially in Boris Uspensky, and there are also some interesting points in Gerard Jeannette. Now, the main term we use in the title of this movie, of this video, I'm using point of view. But point of view is just one term, one possible term to be used to refer to the reality of the identity, position, ideology of the narrator. And some, probably the majority of narratologists are still sticking to the term point of view, and this is the case with Boris Friedman, Uspensky, Fowler, Lichtenschwartz, Schneider, Lancer, and Seymour Chapman. Others prefer the term perspective, and these would be Gerard Jeannette, Jose Sanders, and Erwin Liebfried. There is then the term focalization or focus of narration, preferred by Mieke Bal, by Riemann Cannon, by Chris Peters, and Robert Penn Warren. And last, there is an isolated use of a more special term, mediacy, which would be like the derivative from mediation, mediacy, which is used by Franz Stenzel. Which of these is better? I don't see a lot of differences. The main reason why some people avoid the term point of view or even perspective is that they tend to have certain connotations. Point of view tends to be too visual, and it may not suggest enough the idea of maybe of positioning, of psychological perspective, of interest, of bias. Now on to the first narratologist, Norman Friedman, an American narratologist who lived between 1925 He died in 2014, and he's the author of a book called Point of View in Fiction. Now, he is using just one criterion, and that would be the criterion of natural roles. So just asking question, what does the narrator, which function does the narrator seem to be playing or performing? This, as a plus, is an intuitive typology. It's easy to understand, but it does not conceive more or include more complex or sophisticated situations. So what do we have in Friedman? We have 7 or 8 types, depending. He actually changed a bit the system at some point. So let's see. First, there is a situation suggested by my image here, that of a narrator who is a godlike figure with unlimited access to the character's mind, with the capacity of moving in time, in space, and having access to a lot of knowledge. This he calls neutral omniscience. It's the situation when the author speaks in the impersonal mode in the third person, and it is impersonal, unattached, effectively. The second one would be that when that narrator is still an outsider, still has access to a lot of information, way beyond the possibilities of a simple character, but he has a personality, so he may speak in the first person, he might have likes and dislikes, opinions, which he reveals in the text. And this he calls, Friedman calls, editorial omniscience. The author therefore acts like an editor in a publishing house. He or she intrudes in the narrative with editorial comments or annotations. Then you might have a situation where the narrator is focusing on a single character. And this Friedman calls selective omniscience. The story is viewed through the prism of a single character. And we are following that character, and the depth of insight into the character's mind may be variable from getting a lot into the mind of the character or not so much. A good example in Romania would be Livi Rebreanu, like in Ion, or maybe even better, Pădurea Spânzuraților. Then, of course, the omniscience can be spread or distributed among several characters, like these famous people made into puppets. I hope you recognize some of them. And this is called multiple selective omniscience. The story here is viewed through the prism of several characters. It's typical of the multi-plot or multi-perspective realist novel in especially the 19th century. Of course, we might object to the dilution of the term omniscience. When you call omniscience selective, the question would be, aren't you maybe denying the very omni adjective in the title? If the omniscience is limited, then it's no longer omni, it's no longer total knowledge. This is the first set of 4 types in Friedman. Let's move to the next one, and there we have this. Okay, that, if you know, you probably know, this is Wong, Ali Wong, a stand-up comedian who had a recent show about her pregnancy, speaking about her experiences as a pregnant woman. Now, stories like this in the first person get the name I as protagonist. The central character is the one who also tells his or her story. He or she either summarizes or comments on the story. Another type, quite fitfully suggested by this image, would be obviously the witness. I as witness. The story here is told by an autonomous character that is less involved in the events, less central to the story. Then this one would be, it was a bit difficult to find a good image for this type, but I thought of a mime because the mime is not able to really say everything, or we have to guess a bit what he means because he can only use a part of the expressivity we have. He's mute, right? And that would be the dramatic mode. Yeah, the dramatic mode is a narrative in which the narrator is limited to the words and actions of the characters. He has no access to the character's mind, no access to the past. It is impossible even for him to identify more, anything that is beyond the visual. Friedman added this type, and this would be a CATV camera, the camera mode. It's very similar to the dramatic mode, but there is no selectivity in vision. It's as if the story is told by a surveillance camera, cameras you have on the street or in shops, that cannot make decisions, cannot follow a certain character, okay, unless you're in China. But this category was removed in 1975. So this is Friedman's typology, 8 types with names that are quite evocative, quite easy to remember. There are no clear rules of how to distinguish one type from the other. It's all left to the intuition of the reader. Let's move to another type, and this is Jean Pouillon. Pouillon is not really someone we would be using for complex analysis, because Pouillon only dealt with one aspect of point of view, which was then expanded by other people. So in a volume entitled Temps du roman, the time, temps et roman, a time and the novel, he polished a bit the criterion of knowledge, and he explained it very clearly in very visual metaphors. But of course, being only one criterion, we only have 3 types. And the visual names he uses might be a bit confusing, might be a bit difficult to use. Let's see this. Yeah, Pouillon's first type is called vision from behind, vision par derrière. And I would invite you to look at the guy with a bicycle who's moving away from us. That guy doesn't have the same vision as we have, as the photographer, as the person who took this photograph had. Like, he has no idea that there are those 2 people behind him. Maybe they are chasing him. This is information he doesn't have access to. He will not know what a young girl with those headphones will be doing after they cross their paths. So in other words, here the vision par derrière, vision from behind, involves that the narrator sees and knows actually more than the protagonist. Okay, then you have the vision with, and again trying to use the same visual metaphor. I imagine this being like the GoPro camera on the head of a biker or some other extreme sport practitioner, maybe I don't know, skydiver. So normally such a camera records exactly or more or less what the field of vision of the viewer sees, yeah, because you turn your head to the right, the camera will film to the right, you turn your head to the left, camera follows. So this is this is in visual terms, but in terms of knowledge, obviously the meaning is that the reader, the narrator, sorry, knows as much as the character does. And then you have the vision du dehors, vision from the outside, which I try to exemplify with a recording taken by a surveillance camera, and it's the moment when a thief is, a burglar is breaking in a house. But that camera cannot do a lot of things. The camera just sits there, records everything that is happening, has no idea who the person is, cannot see beneath that mask, has no idea where the guy came from and where he ran away after he robbed the house. So that would translate in narrative terms in a narrator knowing less, much less than his characters. Okay, now this typology was transformed, was adapted by Tsvetan Todorov. And Todorov, in les catégories du récit littéraire, the categories of literary story, he developed Pouillon into an algebraic formula and made it simpler, easier to remember, also easier to translate. It made knowledge a very clear concept, again resulting in three types. So what Todorov did, he used the algebraic sign of greater, equal, and less. Narrator greater than character, corresponding to Pouillon vision par derrière, is a situation seen in the case of the so-called omniscient narrator, narrator who knows more than the character. Then narrator equal character corresponds to Pouillon's vision avec, is a situation of the autobiographical novel or the epistolary novel. And then you have narrator less, less than characters, corresponding to Pouillon's vision du dehors, and this is the situation of the behaviorist novel in which the narrator has no clue about a lot of things, so he ignores a lot of things about his own characters. Now, Todorov's terminology will be inserted into several other more complex typologies. Let's have a look at another Frenchman, Gerard Jeannette, the author of a very popular typology. In Romania, a lot of people are familiar with that, and I think your colleagues in the Romanian department are using it quite a lot. It was also popularized by Jaap Lindveld, whose book was one of the first books about the point of view to be translated into Romania, and who kind of emulated or imitated some of the points found in Jeannette. Jeannette's original book was called Figure 3, and then it was detached. The narrative part was detached under a different title, Discours du récit. The original publication took place in 1972. The key term in his typology is perspective, and this is the way in which the transmission of knowledge to the reader is regulated. It uses 3 criteria. That leads to 12 types of perspective plus 3 subtypes, which I will not cover here. And some names are unique. They are Greek names, and they are easy to be memorized, such as the terms heterodiegetic, homodiegetic. But there are also some terms that are easily confounded, like paralepsis, or some are counterintuitive, like zero focalized narrative. Let's have a look at the other situations he has. Let's say first that Jeannette intended to create a grammar of the narrative, and this is why he operates with notions he borrowed from the grammar of the verb, mood, or voice. And there are 3 criteria in his typology. First criterion is mood. It's like the verbal mood, like indicative, subjunctive. Okay, then there is the voice, like passive voice, active voice in the verb. And then there is alteration, which would be the modifications of the verb, or what you call in Romanian conjugal. Okay, let's see what these result into. First, mood. Mood is would respond to the question, which is the person whose point of view orients the whole narrative. Or if you think of it in terms of a camera, you might ask, where is the camera placed? And you have one first type called non-focalized narrative or zero focalized narrative, which actually means that we do not know where the narrator or the camera is located. This would be the case of the omniscient narrator, who is too, I don't know, too omnipresent, too volatile for us to be able to identify his physical position. The second type here would be narrative with internal focalization, and that has a narrator or the camera located in the mind of the character, hence the term internal. This is obviously the case of the so-called first-person subjective narration. The third and last type here is narrative with external focalization, and the narrator or the camera is located outside the character, but in positions that we might identify, like behind him or something like that. This is the case of the realistic narrative in the third person. Okay, next criterion. His next criterion would be voice. And voice, in the sense of the Athesa, answers a second question, which would be, who is the narrator, or better still, where is the narrator placed in relation to the world of the story? So, and we have two types of narrator. The so-called heterodiegetic narrator, which means that the narrator is different, hence the term hetero, from the world of the story. And here he uses the old Aristotelian term diegesis, which is the story. So heterodiegetic, it's different from the story. So the narrator is not the same, is not in the world of the story. The homodiegetic narrator is the same, homo, as the world as the story. So they he inhabits the world of the story. He's an insider. These terms were taken over. They are very popular. Lindveld uses them, and many people, when they do not want to run a complete analysis of everything here, they like to just use heterodiegetic, homodiegetic to just identify these two positions. Then the last criterion in Jeannette would be alteration, and alteration in the sense of conjugare in Romanian. This responds to the question, how much does the narrator know as compared to the character? And this is where Jeannette carried over, borrowed from Todorov's rationalization of Pouillon's criterion of knowledge. So we have two positions. I have to say the names are rather easily confounded. The first one is paralepsis, which means there is a deficit or a shortage of information in the narrator. And the second one is paralepsis. There is just a vowel making a difference, which means that the narrator has information in excess to that of the character. As you can see, the middle position, that when the narrator has the same amount of information as the character, is lacking. It is actually absorbed in the second. How to distinguish paralepsis from paralepsis? My mnemonic for this would be, think of which of these terms includes the Romanian term lipsa, with E, lipsa. It's the first one, paralepsis, so that's how you could remember that. Okay, so the three criteria used by Jeannette: mood, question, where is the camera placed? We are rehearsing everything now, yeah? Gets you to non-focalized narrative or zero focalized narrative, narrative with internal focalization, a narrative with external focalization. So when we apply Jeannette, we actually have to ask these three questions about the mood about the voice, about the alteration. Each of them gives us one type, and we pick up the type. Let's say we put it in our basket, and we end up with a name that has three characteristics: one type of mood, one type of voice, one type of alteration. Yeah. So let's say you pick up Pip from Great Expectations by Dickens, and when you look at that, you know the story is told by Pip himself, and looking at that, you might say, where are we? We have A2, yeah, because the camera is placed inside the head of Pip. So basically we have A2 narrative with internal focalization. And then we go on to apply the second criterion, the criterion of voice. We ask the question, where is she or he placed in relation to the story? And then there are the two types, heterodiegetic and homodiegetic narrator. So the question is simply asked in order to identify if the narrator is a participant in the story or not. And looking at Pip from Great Expectations, he's a protagonist, the story is about himself, so obviously the type here should be B2, homodiegetic narrator. Homodiegetic because he is inside the diegesis, that is, of the story, of the world of the story. And then we apply the third criterion, and that is alteration. And the question to ask is, how much does the narrator know as compared to the character? And we have the two types, paralepsis and paralepsis. So remember, paralepsis is shortage of information, paralepsis is excess of information. Generally, in a homodiegetic narrator with internal focalization, we assume this is a subjective story of the protagonist. It's maybe, and it could take either the form of a diary novel, like in Pamela, or the form of a memoir or autobiography. There are significant differences between the two. In a diary novel, the character has exact knowledge, as much knowledge as the narrator. Yeah, so the narrator doesn't know more. But the situation changes a bit when we look at the memoir or autobiography type of novel, because there the storyteller is situated at a certain distance from the events, and he has one advantage: he knows how things ended, and that is important. And that means that narrator has greater knowledge of every moment of the story than the hero of that moment had. Even if, let's say, in philosophical terms, they are identical, their knowledge is not. My later version of myself knows more than my earlier version of myself did. So, to sum up, in the case of Great Expectation and Pip, when you are asked what kind of narrative you have here, you should say something like this. We have a narrative with internal focalization, yeah, that was A2, with a heterodiegetic narrator, that is B2, and in a situation of paralepsis, so excess of information, yeah, because this is an autobiography. Okay, so that's how we proceed with Jeannette. Moving on. Philharm Figure from Germany has one of the most appealing typologies of point of view I have seen. He's the author of a book entitled Zur Tiefstruktur des Narratives, the deep structure of the narrative, in which he uses three criteria whose combination results in 12 types. There are some similarities with Jeannette, but on top of that, each type has a distinct name. And you have the freedom of using the names, the individual names of the three criteria as you identify them, or better, you have these rather memorable names for each type. Some of the names for the types are a bit counterintuitive. And another problem is that because this is such a German thing, it looks like all the possible combinations, it even produces some types that are almost impossible. Very difficult to imagine novels that would be running like this. Probably 2 or 3 of his types are like that. Okay, now the scheme I have here is going like this. So the criteria are like this. First, narrative position. And in italics, you have the term as defined by Figure, and then I try to explain it in our own terms. Figure says, this is the position of the narrator as the center of orientation. I would rather say this is the position of the narrator in the story, in or out. And we have 2 positions, and their names are very easy to remember. Internal, the narrator is inside the story, and external, the narrator is outside the story. Then the second criterion is level of narrative perspective. And there, the level, this is defined by Figure as a level of consciousness of the center of attention. This is basically the criterion of knowledge we have also met in Jeannette. So we have 3 types here. Superior, and that means narrator knows more than C. Adequate, that means narrator knows as much as C being character. And inferior, which means narrator knows less than C. And the third criterion is a criterion you are all familiar with, the old school criterion of grammatical form. And this results in 2 types: personal, which means the first person, and apersonal, which refers to the third person. The explanation of why Figure doesn't use simply the term first person, third person, lies in a certain interpretation some people have about the personal pronoun. There are researchers who argue that when you speak about the personal pronoun, you actually refer to the communicational positions, to the positions of the people whose names have been replaced by the pronoun. And actually, in a communication situation, you only need 2 partners, two people. One, it's the producer of the message, the sender of the message, and the other is the receiver, the recipient of the message. So, and these are I, or in the plural we, and respectively you. What about he, she, it, they, the third person pronoun? These researchers would claim that this shouldn't be called personal pronoun because it doesn't refer to a person who is an obligatory member of a conversation. When I talk to you, it's me and you. The third person might come into play, but is not part of our discussion. So that's why the term personal refers to the first person, and I guess it could also refer to the bizarre case of the second person storytelling, and apersonal refers to the third person. Now, Figure's typology is very interesting, and unfortunately my table will not play line by line. I'm going to let the table just show it like this. You have the three criteria are listed in the first 3 columns. So you have the criterion of position, grammatical form, and knowledge. And the last criterion is the resulting type. Yeah, the types for which figure gives a name. What you can see is, I use some colors here to help you follow some of his logic. And if you look at the last column, you will see that you can group the resulting 12 types. There are 12 types in all. You can group them in subgroups of 3. Yeah. The first ones have in common the term neutral. The next 3 have the term authorial. The next one have the term personal, and the last one have the form ich form, I form. So how are each of these big subgroups defined? It's enough to look at the first and the second criterion, and you can see that when you combine exterior position, remember exterior position, someone who is not a participant in the story, like the heterodiegetic narrator in Jeannette, when you combine that with the personal form, the third person form, then you will have neutral types, the so-called neutral type. When you combine exterior with personal, you have authorial. When you combine interior, so that is a character who is a participant in the story, with a personal, you have a type called personal. And when you have combined interior with personal, you have ich form. And inside each group of 3, the distinction between the resulting types is made by the criterion of knowledge. So when you have the situation of exterior, personal, and the criterion of knowledge shows superiority, then the resulting type is neutral Olympian, and this is the godlike type of narrator. Figure probably didn't like to use any kind of Christian terminology, and he preferred Olympian, the Greek antiquity term. The second subtype here ticks adequate in knowledge and is called neutral observational. And the last one here ticks the box of inferior knowledge, and it's called neutral suppositional. And of course there are quite interesting differences between them, because neutral Olympian is truly what you would call omniscient, whereas neutral suppositional is probably more like the camera-like type or the dramatic type, which you find in behaviorist novels or in the Nouveau Roman in France. Then when we move to the second group, there you have exterior plus personal giving authorial. And the subdivisions of the other types of knowledge give you, with superior you have authorial directorial, with adequate knowledge you have authorial situational, with inferior knowledge you have authorial conjectural. Then there is the third group called personal, which results from the combination of the criterion of interior position with the criterion of a personal grammatical form, that is third person. And there with superior you have personal spectral, with adequate you have personal mediator oriented, and inferior you have personal periphery oriented. Some of these are indeed quite bizarre, like the one in which a character, the first one, which he has this very bizarre name, personal spectral. What would personal spectral mean? So let's see. It means that the narrator is an insider, so he's a character. It also means that the narrator speaks in the third person, so the story is not about him, but he has superior knowledge. And that is a bit bizarre because how could a person from inside a story have superior knowledge? And I guess Figure was also concerned about how problematic this category was, and he suggested this might be maybe like a ghost of someone who knows more about the others and who's more like a witness to the story. It's not truly um, involved. The last category, which results from the combination of the interior position criterion plus personal grammatical form, that is the first person pronoun, is called ich form. And for some reason, the British never bothered to translate this. Ich form means I form. Ich it is the first person pronoun. And there you have, with superior knowledge, you have ich form retrospective. And this is the situation we have seen, the situation of the autobiographical or memoir story, yeah, where the narrator is a participant in the story. He speaks in the first person and he knows more about himself than he should know. And of course, this doesn't make sense, apparently, but when you consider the situation of the memoir, you realize, yeah, as if I tell the story of my past, if I tell it now, the story of my, I don't know, my something happening 10 years before, I am actually looking at a person who's still me, but who knew much less about life than I know now. The second type, ticking adequate, is called ich form simultaneous, and that would be, I guess, the situation of the diary type of novel. And inferior, this is problematic. How could someone be a participant in his own story, tell his own story or her own story in the first person, and not know much about him or herself? Apparently, it doesn't seem to make much sense. The term used by Figure is not very helping. He calls it ich form enigmatic. But when you look at that, you realize, oh, that might be the situation which is so often portrayed in movies nowadays, of someone suffering from amnesia, a person who doesn't know what he or she should know about himself, doesn't know his name or doesn't know his own history. He lost his memory. So this is the very Germanic, very organized typology presented by Fugger. We'll take another one, and this is Shlometh Rimon Kenan from Israel, who has a very interesting typology which brings in some very new, very original criteria, which some of them I didn't even mention in my previous class presentation of the possible criteria. So this theory is pretty old. It was written down in 1963 in a work called Narrative Fiction. It uses 3 facets which total 5 criteria, and when you look at their combination, you would have a theoretical, but probably not possible, total of 32 types, which is mind-blowing. But generally, you'll probably still end up in the region of, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9 more realistically credible types. It introduces space as a criterion, which is very interesting. It introduces time. It's the only theory to refer to time. It then also, it's also the only theory to include ideology and emotion. And let's have a look at how this works. The key term here is focalization, and it's defined by Kenan as the angle of vision through which the history is filtered. There are 3 facets in here. There is a perceptive facet, which refers to one's perception, and this is subdivided into space, a space criterion, and then a time criterion. Then there is a psychological facet, which includes a cognitive component and an emotional component. And last, there is the ideological facet, which is also which doesn't have any subdivisions. And let's look at each of these. How do they apply? The perceptive facet has two subsets. One of them is space, and there are here two possible situations: the panoramic view and then the limited view. Yeah, and this has to do with what kind of a vision we have of the space inhabited by the characters. Are we able to see in several rooms of the house? Is it possible for us to see what happens at the same time in several places on the battlefield? Then you have the panoramic view. If you cannot access all these places, then it results you have the limited view. The criterion of time is looking basically is extracting the situation of is distinguishing between simultaneous and retrospective. So there is a panchronic and a retrospective situation. The retrospective situation speaks for itself, is the situation when the narrative looks at the past, so it doesn't happen at the same time. The narration happens afterwards. So panchronic is another term to refer to simultaneous narration, like some rare novels that have the storytelling in the present. The second facet is called the psychological facet, and it has first a cognitive subfacet, which refers to knowledge. And there you have restricted knowledge. I don't think I need to explain this. This is the situation in which the narrator doesn't know everything about the characters, and you have the unrestricted knowledge, in which you have more everything and also maybe more. So that would combine adequate knowledge plus superior knowledge. And then the second subset here is called emotional, the emotional. And this one looks at objective narration, the narration which is neutral, impersonal, uninvolved, and distinguishes it from the subjective, which is obviously personal, involved, and everything else. And last, there is the ideological facet, in which we distinguish the narrator's ideology, and I put here a longer explanation. It implies that the novel or the story is a vehicle for the expression of the author's ideology. The author might impose his ideas to his characters, or there might be a contrast. So that is a situation in which, I don't know, you might have a novel about runaway criminals, and even if we follow them, we are with them, we rub with them in all the situations of the escape. You do have a feeling that the author, the narrator, doesn't condone with their crime, and either he arranges that they should be caught, or that they should suffer some, I don't know, some blows, or simply he introduces characters that speak badly of them. So in this way, we realize that there is a break, a gap between the interests of those characters and the ideology of the narrator. And then The other situation would be where the story follows the character's ideology, and in this case, you might have a story where the criminals, the runaway criminals, are being portrayed in their, I don't know, joy of escaping, and there are no ulterior moral considerations from the narrator. So this, the only ideology here, or the only philosophy, is that expressed by the characters. And I think this is a very interesting criterion. It looks a bit like the criterion of interest, which we presented last time. So these would be 6 of the most interesting types. I would probably stick to about 3, maybe 4 of these. I would stick to Riemann canon. I would stick to Figure, and I would stick to Jeannette as people that offer a good choice of types, a clear manner of distinguishing the types of point of view, and easy to remember names for each type. I would exclude in a more orderly or more scientific discussion of point of view. I would tend to exclude Norman Friedman, even if his theory looks very comprehensive. It still has 8 types, but somehow there you have no clear indications of how to identify those subtypes. With the authors I mentioned here, you do have a clear pathway to successfully identify the point of view.